The point being is that don't rely and don't default just to one style. You need to incorporate as many as you can. What's interesting to me is I'm a better coach at preaching than I am as a preacher. So I listen to a lot of sermons. I coach a lot of leaders, and I have, for many years, I've listened to a lot of different sermons. At one point in my career, I was listening to about 45 sermons a year, which outside of going to church. So I was listening to my own preacher, which was 52 weeks out of the year, and then listening to about 45 other messages. What I found is that prophets, people that are very declarative, when you say, okay, so you got to work on being a priest, you know, they go, okay, I'm going to work on being a priest. But it still comes out declarative, you know. So, and some of you may be struggling right now with not believing, and you're struggling in your own personal walk with Jesus. Let me just tell you that Jesus Christ is your shepherd, and he's caring for you, and he loves you, and he will not let you down. Now, that's priestly, that's true, but that's very declarative. Doesn't change his style in the way he's delivering his priestly truth. So there's a way in which you develop as a preacher to be able to adjust your style to the way in which you want to communicate the truth that you're communicating. The other thing I'd say is, in the kingly thing, and a lot of people today are not kingly because we've kind of rejected that model a lot in our striving to be away from the seeker-sensitive thing that we're very, you know, handouts and here's what you've got to do is. But the problem is most people need to know, well, what do you want me to do with this? Like, what do I do next? You know, where do I go from here? And what are some steps that I can do to apply what you've just said? And the majority of people in this world, and the majority of people in your churches, that's where they live. They need to be given some direction in life. So don't default. What I'm saying is don't default. All right, the second one is your model or your school of grace-centered preaching. And this is an important part too. You should know your gospel model for preaching Christ. There's more than one way, I believe there's more than one way to be a grace-centered, gospel-preaching kind of preacher. There's more than one model to follow. But I want you to know it's more than just having an altar call at the end of your sermon. that gospel-centered, grace-centered preaching is throughout the sermon in your model. Pastors that preach for behavioral change tend to elevate the rules of middle-class values to the level of godliness, and they work hard for external change and conformity. The truth is that the people that are sitting in your church, the root of all their problems is that something other than Christ is what they're orbiting their life around. And they may be singing in the worship time, Christ is enough for me. Christ is enough for me. And in the back of their mind, in the back of their heart is, I have Christ, but I need a better job. I got Jesus, but what I really need is some more money. I got Jesus, but what I really need is a better spouse. I got Jesus, but what I really need is a better 401k. Because that's what they're really living for. That's what they're orbiting their life around. And in an unbelief in God's promise in his Son and trusting in someone or something else for their life, or what they think is their life. You had Brian Chappell a couple years back. I watched some of his presentations to you all. In his book on Christ-centered preaching, he says, there's no precise formula should instruct preachers on how to maintain a Christ-centered perspective regarding the application of biblical truth. However, when people walk away from a message understanding that grace both motivates and enables them to serve God, futile human striving vanish. Preachers then should make God's redemptive work the content, now watch, and the motive, and the power behind any biblical exposition. Only when people look beyond themselves for spiritual health do they find their sole hope and source of power to do what God requires. So Christocentric, gospel grace saturated preaching points us always back to a cross and to a resurrected Jesus and to an ascended Christ who reigns as King. Now, whatever model you use will be related to the answer that you have to the question that I asked, how do people change? And you already have your answer. You've already done it in your own life. Gospel-centered preaching believes that Jesus Christ can change any person or any institution through the power of his gospel. Gospel preachers let the gospel do its work. We have the banner right here to say it. It comes from that verse. I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes it. It not only has power to change people, it is power, this gospel that we've been talking about. Now, like I said, in my years of experience listening to gospel-centered preaching, I found that there are at least 7 different models or schools of those who consider themselves gospel-centered preachers. I'm not going to go through those schools. If you're interested, I have a thing on our website you can go to, and there's a module on gospel-centered preaching, or preaching to the post-everything world, and I go through those. But when you think of some of the better, as you learn a model, you'll learn the model probably that where you learn to preach in school or in seminary or in Bible college, or you guys are learning from your pastor as you watch him preach, and he's working with you on how you develop a sermon, and that's good. And you should develop, and you will develop a model, and it may change as you go. I'm not going to advocate one school over another, but we need to be careful that we're not critical of other people's models because they're preaching Christ. They just don't do it the way we do it. I do it better. They're preaching Christ as the solution to the problem that we have. So when you think of some of the better known gospel preachers today, you immediately realize that none of them are alike in their style or in their model of gospel-centered preaching. Matt Chandler and Joby Martin, guy down in Jacksonville with a mega church, and I guess maybe Matt's not even preaching right now, but they're both Acts 29 preachers, but they're very different. Tim Keller, Sinclair Ferguson are both Presbyterians, but if you've ever listened to them preach, they don't preach alike at all. Ed Stetzer's Southern Baptist. He doesn't preach like a lot of Southern Baptist preachers that I hear. John Piper, Tim Keller, Brian Chappell, all gospel preachers, but they all have a different model. Piper's model of preaching the gospel is not the same as Keller's model in preaching the gospel. And Keller's model in preaching the gospel is not the same as Brian Chappell's model in preaching the gospel. Or Jack Miller's model in preaching the gospel. Everybody's got a different model. They're all preaching Christ. So if you use Gospel Coalition's resource as a site for your preaching, you'll find very different approaches to preaching the gospel. Here's the point. Don't get confused by it all. There's different gospel preaching approaches. Experiment with how you get the gospel into your sermon, how it's integrated in what's happening. But one thing I will say, if you remain at the level of behavioral change, if you preach at this level, that's where you stay. Trying to change their behavior. You need to forgive people. Okay. You need to give your tithe to the church. You don't need to be anxious anymore because Jesus said don't be anxious. You need to love your wife. All these exhortations that are true exhortations, whether they're good or bad. I was in a church a couple years back and they had a whole sermon on, the whole service was about the whole issue of pornography. And I can remember 2 points. And it was a guy had a long sermon about it. He probably had about 20 points, but I remember 2 of them. Put your computer out into the 3 points. Get Covenant Eyes, which was something. Put that on your computer. Put your computer out. Don't have it in a private area. Put it in a public area where people can see what you're doing. And don't look at pictures of naked people. I mean, he didn't say it that way, but that's what he meant. Well, that's a lot of help. Thank you very much. All surface. All surface. Or positive sermons that you preach. It's Mother's Day. We're going to preach a great sermon about the love of mothers. Isn't the love of mothers wonderful? Mothers love their children unconditionally, and if you're a good mother, and then on Father's Day, you guys suck as dads. That's the way it was when I was growing up. Mother's Day was how wonderful mothers are, and Father's Day was about how much you suck as dads. You're not spending time with your kids. And the research shows, right? Oh, great, thank you. But if you're preaching at that and you're preaching to mothers about how wonderful motherhood is, and you're wonderful mothers, and we love you, and you're such giving people, and you're just promoting their fame. You're building them up. Not preaching about Jesus. So whether it's good or bad. Remember, the model you're preaching is answer to how you believe God changes people. So read through your sermons. Go back. Watch yourself. Like game film. I'm going to talk about that in a second. See what the core message is. What motivations are you impressing upon how your people are going to be transformed by the message that you're telling them? Is it just the law? Is it just the rule? Give more. Tithe more. God said it. Believe it. Now do it. Or stop it. This past year, I was listening to a sermon by a guy we were doing a streamlined assessment on everything. We do that as part of our project of our ministry, and we do streamlined assessments of potential planters. Guy sent in the sermon. I listened to the sermon. Great, very entertaining, loved the thing. He got down to his 3 points. It was all about the flesh, about how we need to do battle with the flesh. Here are his 3 takeaways. I remember it. He said, it's like you learned as a child. When you got to a railroad track, when you got to a railroad track, what are you supposed to do? Stop, look, and listen. So you're battling with the flesh. I kid you not, he said these words. Stop it. Don't live in the flesh. Look for other opportunities that God has for you instead of the fleshly path you're on, the sinful path you're on. Look for another path. And then listen to the Holy Spirit. Well, that was a nice message. But that didn't have anything to do with Jesus as a motive or the means or the glory or the power of how that happens. Here's the model of moralistic preaching. Here's what God says in the Bible that you must do. Here are the steps of how you're to do what God has said you to do in the Bible. Now go do that. Try hard. God will help you. And if you fail, He'll forgive you. That's basically how moralistic preaching goes. You got to get to the motivational level. What are they really relying on for their approval, for their comfort, for their security? It's not gospel preaching if you're not getting down into the heart level, because you're not going to bring any radical transformation, because you're not dealing with the heart. It's simply moral restraint. And that's the same with doctrinal truth preaching. The presupposition in doctrinal truth only preaching is people will change by knowledge. If I give them enough knowledge, if I give them enough doctrine, the doctrine will change them. For sermons that simply are doctrinal truth oriented, the presupposition is people change by accumulation of knowledge. Calvin said, doctrine has no power unless efficacy is imparted to it from above. Christ holds out an example to teachers, not to employ themselves only in the sowing of the word, but by mingling prayers with it, to implore the assistance of God that His blessing may render their labor fruitful. In other words, he's saying, you can't just give doctrine, because it doesn't change things. It's just knowledge. It's accumulation of knowledge. And knowledge puffs up. This is one of my favorite quotes in the whole wide world. I wish I had written it. Let's read this together out loud. Can you see it? You guys got good enough eyes? Paul, you got good enough eyes to see that? Yeah? I think so. Okay. Let's read this together. The freer the gospel, the more sanctifying is the gospel. And the more it is received as a doctrine of grace, the more will it be felt as a doctrine according to godliness. Retain a single shred or fragment of legality with the gospel, and we raise a topic of distrust between man and God. We take away from the power of the gospel to melt and to conciliate. For this purpose, the freer it is, the better it is. And never does the sinner find within himself so mighty a moral transformation as when, under the belief that he is saved by grace, he feels constrained thereby to offer his heart a devoted thing and to deny ungodliness. Man, I wish I'd written that. That is so good. And that's what gospel preaching does. It inspires me, brings people back to the grace of God. Not preaching the law of God to people, preaching this grace that we're constrained then to live a different way. It's a great, so that's the scene from Lord of the Rings, right? You've seen that movie. And Bilbo has the ring, and Gandalf is asking him, what are you going to do about this ring? Bilbo's getting ready to take off. He says, oh, it's on the mantle. He says, oh, yeah, really? He says, no. Actually, it's here in my pocket. And he pulls the ring out, and he looks at it, and he goes, it's my precious. And then Gandalf's like, it's been called that before, but not by you. And this ring is a thing that is dominating him, right? And he says, you need to give that ring up. Gandalf tells him, you need to give that ring up. And he goes, and then Baggins gets all flustered and he's all mad. He says, who are you to take it? This is my property. I can keep it if I want it. This is mine. And then he speaks to him in a powerful and yet tender way. He says, I'm not trying to harm you. I'm trying to help you. The people in your congregation have a ring in their pocket. They're keeping hold of it. They don't want to give it up. They don't want to let go of this. Because the reality is they haven't found Christ sufficient yet. Then Baggins says, You're right. I'll leave it. And then he walks to the door. And Gandalf says, hello. It's still in your pocket. And he pulls it out. And then there's this wonderful scene. He's looking at the ring, and he has to turn his hand slowly, until the ring drops. And then he has a big sigh, and he heads to the door. He says, I think I found a wonderful ending to my story. And they lived happily ever after. He finally was able to let go of the ring. That's what your preaching should do to people. Every sermon should be a conversion experience for them. Every sermon. You should be preaching for conversion, for them to let go of the thing, of the source idol in their life that they think is providing them life. And it's a good thing that's been elevated to the most important thing. It could be their children. It could be their marriage. It could be a job. It could be a promotion. It could be a safe, secure 401k, no matter what it is. If it's elevated to the thing, your preaching should get them to convert from relying on that to relying on Jesus. That's what every sermon should be about. So I'm going to guess that most of you were trained to preach in Bible college or seminary or at your church. And you've preached to theological students and professors. I think that preaching, you have to be a good surgeon and you got to aim for the heart. Again, what are people really living for? On the surface, you can see money, you can see sex, you can see fame, you can see kids, you can see family, you can see job. But you got to get beneath that. Good gospel preaching examines and probes and diagnoses and identifies the false saving ways that people are living. And it soothes them with the renewing grace of Jesus Christ. It conciliates their hearts. He's the only solution. He's the highest good. One of the guys I'm coaching Gosh, this is in my notes. I usually get in trouble when I get off my notes. But one of the guys that I'm coaching was saying, he says, I'm having a problem with church now. He says, it's like people they came back from COVID. And at first there was a good gathering. People came back. They were all happy to see each other. But now it's like people are coming like once a month. It used to be one and a half times a month. Now it's down to about one time a month. It's like every Sunday it's a different group of people. There's never the same, the church of 150 people, it's never the same 150 people in the room. It's because it's shifting, because every week there's a different, group of people, because they're only coming once a month. And he goes, I don't know what to do. I want to tell them, I mean, they're not coming because they're just, we wanted to go to see the leaves change. We decided to go to the lake house. We went to go see Grandma and Grandpa. We just slept in. We watched it online. We just felt like having pancakes, and so that took longer. And so because they all have different reasons. Not like they're out of church. And so what do I do? How do I get these people back to church? So what do you think I told them? Well, I'm a coach, so I didn't really tell them anything. But what do you think I asked them questions about? Anybody? Well, one thing for sure is you better not preach on the rule from Hebrews, Do not forsake the gathering yourselves together. Give them the go to church rule. That'll make them come back. You could do that if you wanted to. So what's the motivation? It's here. It's in this. They have not found Jesus as the most exceptional thing in their world. That they would say, Jesus is so exceptional in my world, I want to go to church and worship him with my brothers and sisters. I want to exalt the name of Jesus, because he's the highest good that there is. So you got to start making drops into the way you communicate about what is it that people are really living for. So, a couple of things. Christianity, conservative Christianity, is a subculture in America. In your audience, it's a subculture. If this represents your community, the people that live in your area of your church, like that's the surrounding area, You just went door to door in your community. You met scores of people, hundreds of people. How many Christians did you guys say you ran into? 0, right? All right. So you represent the Christians that live in that community. You're a little dot in that community. And all around you are people that aren't Christian. If you preach to that dot, how are we going to reach the surrounding neighborhood? If that's all we're preaching to is that dot. Conservative Christianity is a subculture. I think one of the things we've got to do as preachers is stop preaching to the dot. Christianese is a language not spoken by most people in America. You got to translate your sermons a lot. And I mean translate, I mean you got to break down the words that you're using. Gospel. On any given Sunday, there's doubters that are sitting in your congregation. There's cynics. Listen, there's doubters. There are people that you think are solid Christians, and in their heart of hearts, they're not sure Christianity is true. They're not sure that this is real. They're still doubting it. They're cynical people. They're religious people. They're irreligious people. They're religious prodigals. What do I mean by religious prodigals? They're far away from God, but they're doing all the right things. And there are irreligious prodigals. There are people that are wounded. There are people that are maturing in their following of Jesus. But they all share the same struggle with their hearts. I'm going to give you another piece of advice about your audience. You got to get to the point. Most preachers don't get to the point. Like, what's the point of this? Place a higher premium on prayer than you have. Jesus never taught his disciples how to preach, but he sure spent a lot of time teaching them how to pray. So that's your audience. And then prayer and preaching. If preaching is mainly or primarily communication, then we should place a high premium on technique. If preaching is mainly or primarily communication, then we ought to place a very high premium on our techniques. But if you want to reach the heart, only God can reach the heart. And one of the means God uses to penetrate the heart is prayer. You need to spend more time in prayer than you think you need to. Whatever you think you're spending in prayer, it's not enough. We need to spend time praying about our sermons. Oops. So, a couple of practical postscripts.
You talking about praying during the service or praying?
While you're preparing, while you're preparing during the service, having people praying during the service. I think we should have a prayer meeting after the service. One of the parables that Jesus taught was about how the seed goes out and then the devil comes and he snatches it from people, from the hearers. We need to be praying that the evil one doesn't snatch what was just delivered to people. Yeah. But if you really believe that only God can get to the heart, then we've got to pray the sermon that we're preparing that it gets to the heart, because only God can get down into the heart. I can't get to the heart. So some practical things. Scheduling. If you haven't ever preached a lot, you need to lay out a schedule for preaching. Like, here's I'm going to preach so many times a year. If you think there's 52 weeks, you're going to get 4 weeks of vacation or 2 weeks of vacation. This is for senior pastors. I guess not all of you are, so I won't go into that. But schedule out your time. Study rhythms, that's another thing. Do you know how you study? Do you know how you best prepare? Don't wait till Saturday night. You had 6 months to prepare your sermon?
About 5, yeah.
5 months?
Yeah.
That was very kind of Nate to give you 5 months.
Yeah.
Yep. I bet you Nate wishes he had 5 months to prepare his sermons every Sunday. But your study rhythms, like how do you study best? Do you study a little bit at a time best? So if you're going to be a preacher, you got to learn, how do I study? How do I prepare? Not everybody gets 5 months. So how do you prepare? What's the study rhythm that I have? A lot of guys cram on Saturday night, which I don't understand. How does it percolate in your heart if you're cramming it all in on Saturday night? Somebody said at the table that that's what Spurgeon did, right? I don't know if that's true or not, but you're not Spurgeon. Trust me. Teaching teams, another way to go. Prepping together, considering themes. So if you're trying to build preachers in your church, in your community, show them, bring them into the preparation process and show them how to ask questions and how to break a text down and learn together, teach together, prep together, consider themes together. Like where should we go in the church? What happens next? Value being coached in your preaching. Everybody can get better at this. And since this is your calling's craft, if you're going to be a preacher, you should be diligent to do it well. But remember something. There is no preaching righteousness. Preaching is not your life. When there's preaching righteousness, when people say bad things about our preaching, preachers get defensive. Or they get so downcast and wounded, they want to give up. There's no preaching righteousness. Preaching isn't your life. It's what you do. One of the things that you do, but it's not your life. Jesus is your life. Then practice. I believe you should memorize your introduction. You have about 2 to 3 minutes to make them think that this sermon has something that they need before they tune out. I preach a lot of places now, like here, like I did. I preach as a guest. I go to the church that I go to. I get to preach periodically and stuff like that. But I travel, and when I get to do it. One of the things I've learned is don't start with a lot of chit-chat. You kind of got to get into it and get people in. And then in the course of it, you can thank the people and all things around you. But I don't understand. Even the pastor of the church that I go to, he'll get up there and there's a lot of this just chat. Now, last Sunday, we talked about this, and here's what we reviewed and stuff like that. And you know what everybody said? They just goes, they power it out. If I want to hear what you talked about last Sunday, I'll go watch it on YouTube. Or I would have been here. I don't need you to review for 10 minutes what you preached on last week. You got to captivate your audience right away. You got a couple minutes. That's it. Like they need to sit there and go, I need to hear what this is about. I need this. This is important. Martin Lloyd-Jones said, I felt that in preaching, the first thing that you had to do was to demonstrate to the people that what you're going to do was very relevant and urgently important for their life. People are asking themselves, does this have anything to do with me? Is it pertinent to my situation, to my family, to my work? Will there be something that I can take away from this message? And I think, too, you need to create tension. Sermon delivery is kind of a story arc. You create, every story has a beginning, then it has a tension point, and then it has a resolve. Any good movie, any good story you've ever read, it begins the way the grand narrative begins. There was good, there was God, there was this, and he created this perfect Eden, and then things got really messed up. Boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. Girl gets boy, girl loses boy, girl gets boy back. That's the narrative of most great, right? And sermons need to create that tension. There was something, whatever this value, whatever this thing you're going to preach about, but it's been lost. We don't have it. It's a crisis. And you've got to build this resolve for them. Like, how is this going to ever be resolved? Oh, Jesus resolved it. Jesus has done this already on your behalf. Work at asking great questions to provoke interest. They need to be thinking, yeah, I have this question too. Please, keep talking. I have this predicament. And one of the things that I've learned with that, the church that I'd pastored had, it doesn't matter what the size was, fairly large church, but it was because we moved in this direction and people felt like they could bring their non-Christian friends to the church because they knew that's kind of the predicament that so-and-so's in. But if you're not preaching at all to where people are, then your Christian people are going to go, my non-Christian friends or even some of my Christian friends, they would not understand what we do here at all. Wouldn't understand the language, wouldn't understand the Christianese, wouldn't understand the problems that are being faced here. Anyway, there was a wonderful line in Forrest Gump. He said many times, that's all I've got to say about that. So, I'm done. Thank you for today.